Hello, everyone.
Hey, Bob.
How are things this evening?
Good, Professor. How are you?
Good, good. Thanks, John. Any questions before we begin? By the way, does anyone know what anniversary day today is? It's the 19th of October. Important Revolutionary War event. Happened in, yes, Jake, are you going to say something?
Battle of Yorktown?
You are very close. It was the date of the surrender at Yorktown in 1781. Very good. You probably would have spoken with more authority had I said there was going to be a cash prize, but you did get it, and good, very good. So surrender at Yorktown, October the 19th of 1781. Not the end of the war, but we'll be talking about that as we go along. We do have a guest tonight with us, since our next assignment is one that's going to require you to look at some town records, and a number of you have had questions about that assignment. So I have invited Jonathan Lane, who is the coordinator for Revolution 250. This is the consortium of groups looking to commemorate the anniversaries of the revolution. And so that has been his task, to get these groups together. And he's also been looking into what town records are available. And he is a real student of history. So we're really grateful to have Jonathan Lane with us tonight to talk a little bit about this assignment and what you can be doing, how you can find stuff, and how to make this worthwhile, both for you and your careers as historians and for the creation of an historical record. So thank you, Jonathan.
Welcome, Bob. Happy to be here. I presume you want me to take the floor from here?
Yes.
Okay. So welcome to everyone. Thanks for studying the American Revolution. Certainly this coming 250th anniversary commemoration is going to be the next sort of big national celebration. At least we hope it will be. Hopefully by the time we get around to the nation's 250th birthday, people will have forgotten what a horrible, horrible year 2020 has been. But we'll see how it all plays out. And, as I tell people, I'm old enough to remember the bicentennial. So, during the bicentennial, we were just coming out of Vietnam. We had the Watergate scandal. We were in a sort of economic malaise. And the bicentennial really helped to bring the people back together and remember what it was that we were all standing for. And I say this because in large part it does tie into the records Professor Allison's asked you to look at across the communities of Massachusetts. And right from the get-go for Revolution 250, the organization that I coordinate, the idea was to build something that went beyond Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill and the Tea Party and the massacre. Those are all very Boston-centric events. And it is true, Boston being the capital city, a lot of events took place there. And a lot of the events that we memorialize are memorialized because, of course, they appear in the Boston newspapers at the time. Boston had more newspapers at the time than any other colony. In fact, most of the other colonies combined, if I remember rightly. So there's a reason why those events play such a big role in our national memory. But as John Adams said, and I'm sure Professor Allison's already used this line, the revolution really took place in the hearts and minds of the people long before a drop of blood was spilt at Lexington and Concord. And the more you read the records of people away from the capital cities, the more you understand that to be true. And one of the things that helped bring that home to me was a series of correspondences, and the New York Public Library has a collection from the Boston Committee of Correspondence. And these are letters that the Boston Committee of Correspondence wrote to other communities, but it's also, they kept the responses of those communities to the Boston Committee for Correspondence. And, while we all grow up learning the words and the writings of people like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and Ben Franklin many of the other founding fathers, notable worthies and whatnot. These letters were written by people who were just in their towns, and this was at a time when the people of Massachusetts wielding power in government, they were farmers, they were fishermen, some of them were in fact merchants or clergy. There was a there was a real sense of community responsibility. I just did a piece on the Massachusetts militia during this time, and there are people ask, talk about the rise of the movement towards independence, and for the people of Massachusetts, they gather together in their congregational churches and they elect their own ministers. They gather together in their towns and communities. They elect all of their own officers, and then in the militia, the men between the ages of 16 and 60, although in this period it's really 16 to 50. They are required to be part of the militia, and they elect their own officers. And so there's this real drive of self-government that appears not just in Boston or Philadelphia or New York. It really appears in every aspect of your life in 18th century Massachusetts. And so one of the things that these letters from the committees of correspondence, and they're talking about non-importation agreements. They'll go on to talk about the call for independence and other things, but they're really written by people who have little or no formal education, and they're drawing on examples that mean something to them. So one community, for instance, the fellow who wrote the letter was obviously very active in his local church. He, is post sort of a great revival, but his letter to the Committee of Correspondence on behalf of his community is filled with these wonderful allusions to these Old Testament stories. And, so for me, having to go back and look at, so what story is he actually referencing here, and trying to understand where his mind frame at. At the same time, you have other letters written by people who are obviously veterans of the French and Indian Wars. And so they're talking about their experiences in, defending hearth and home on the Western frontier, which of course for them was, New York. But they overtly in these letters, some of them are threatening the British authorities by saying, if they think they're going to send an army here and prevent us from exercising our rights as British subjects, then what happened to General Braddock on the Pennsylvania frontier, where his entire column was almost wiped out? That's going to happen to them in Massachusetts. And so you really get this interesting mix, and the letters all fall within a range, and some of them are very pro forma. Some of them are, we of course promise that we won't import tea or any other British goods, or we promise to support independence with our lives, our liberties, and our fortunes. So, the great thing about these records is it really gives you a better view of the entire tapestry that is the American Revolution. In the words and opinions of people who lived not in the capital city, but lived much further away. So we began looking at some of these town records. Of course, in Massachusetts, it is state law that these communities have to preserve their own town records. There is no central repository for town records in Massachusetts. There are some town records in the state archives, absolutely true. And then there are thousands, tens of thousands of communications from local communities to various officials in Boston during this time period. And most of those are all digitized. You can access them through familysearch.org if you do a search in their catalog for Massachusetts archives, and you look for the colonial archives of Massachusetts, and that covers everything, of course, from 1630 through early 19th century for them. Really, after the Massachusetts Constitution. But in going through it, they're pretty well categorized. They're not indexed, so you can't really search records per se. But there are sometimes for each digitized volume, there are indexes at the front. So for instance, there is a section there where you can go look and it says town records. And there are some town records there. They almost all tend to be vital statistics, births, deaths, marriages. Those are the things that the state's particularly interested in, of course, but there are some other records as well. And then, of course, each town maintains its own records. And this is really the exciting part of the American study of the American Revolution in our time. Some towns have begun digitizing the records, which is great. And it's wonderful. If you can find little pieces and interesting facts. So for instance, it wasn't actually in an actual town record, but it was in the minutes of a local congregational church, I think in, I want to say Leominster, or someplace up along the northern border of Massachusetts. And this congregational minister actually noted in the minutes of his church records that the town had gotten together on the previous Saturday and had erected a liberty pole. And they had affixed this patriotic verse to the liberty pole, which other communities had done. So, there are church records, which I know Professor Allison has talked about as well, but the town records, for the ones that have been digitized, what we're looking for, I guess, is to shorten this narrative, is information on how the communities dealt with any number of topics. So there were, of course, the non-importation agreements, which I'd spoken of before. And for a lot of communities, it wasn't as big a deal as you might think, although, tea certainly was an object that you could find in almost any community. Painters' colors is another one of those things that they promised not to import. And one of the important questions we have about that is the rise of domestic manufacture. So we have records, for instance, of groups of women getting together in communities and not learning, but really working at spinning and weaving. And these are things that had been done on sort of a casual basis in the Commonwealth, but never really on what we would consider an industrial scale. And I use industrial lightly. I mean home manufacture, home, the term homespun is used for a reason. So this was a real way that women in the communities were helping to drive domestic manufacture. And there were certain numbers of goods that Americans were by law they could not produce. Many of them are things relating to military supplies, gunpowder being one. There were forges in Massachusetts. They did cast cannons and they did make muskets, but not to avoid the obvious pun. I mean, that's an industry that really exploded in the early part of the American Revolution because obviously they needed supplies for defending themselves and for supporting the cause of independence. And the town records contain information on things that are being manufactured in town. So for instance, treasurer's records, the towns were responsible for initially paying for everything. So if you were a Minuteman and you were out training, say 2 or 3 times a week, and you had to provide your own musket and your powder horn and your bayonet and all your other accoutrement, if you didn't have any of those things, the town would pay for them. And then the town would pay for you to train as a Minuteman 2 to 3 times a week. And so all of that you would find in the town treasury records, for instance. So you could go through, you can see, well, how many payments are they making for the Minutemen? Now, eventually that cost does get passed on to the provincial Congress, but at the outset, the town is really on the hook for all of these things. And I just want to say something about that in particular. One of the things that you will notice as you go through, particularly financial records in the 18th century, is that people expected to be, there were no freebies. Your time, every minute of it that you spent on doing something for your community, and we like to think of them as these altruistic, patriots fighting for the rights of men everywhere. But in reality, they recognize the value of time, and not to them necessarily to their own person, although I'm sure there were more than a few, but for their families. Every time you spend away from your farm or your shop or whatever your trade was, is time, is money that your family didn't get for its own support. And so all of these things, tend to be, if you were a post rider and, Paul Revere comes to your town and it's your job to take that message and go on to the south or to the north or to some other direction, you would charge for your time. And not only for your time, if you didn't have a horse, you'd charge out the hire of a horse and your food and drink along the way. And it seems, like they're nickel and diming their community, but again, they are being very responsible towards their families who, require their money for their support. So treasurer's records are a great place to start. Town meeting records. So I'm sure Professor Allison has already told you that in May of 1776, months before the Continental Congress took up the cause for independence, the Provincial Congress of Massachusetts asked every community in Massachusetts to debate independence and whether or not they would support independence with their lives, their liberty, and their fortunes. And in the town meeting records that I've been able to collect so far, again, there's a varied amount of detail. So some towns, they just record a simple vote, yay or nay. Other communities record, the people standing up and saying, no more, that we need to be independent. And other communities say, we've been asked to take under consideration the cause for independence. We're going to table this. And then they meet, a couple of weeks later, and they'll table it again. And then they'll meet a couple of weeks later. And, as you get the impression, and this may be false, but you get the impression that they're also waiting to see how communities around them are going to act before they undertake things. And, there was a lot of pressure because it is not a united movement by any stretch of the imagination. So the town meeting records are a great place to start. And if you get a chance to look at them, don't start in 1775. You go back to 1769 is probably where I would start. And typically that may seem like a lot further back than you need to go, but really with the arrival of the British troops in 1768, that's when things really begin to heat up, and you start looking at non-importation agreements. There's usually a resolution that gets passed in 1773 for swearing tea throughout the community. In 1774 is the Boston Port Closure Act, and in 1774 you see towns begin to take in poor and indigent people from Boston and Charlestown because they essentially couldn't get anything since their access to the sea was closed. So you'll see records in the towns of, the number of families they're supporting. And in some cases, they are literally bringing families to, say, Rutland, Massachusetts, or to Great Barrington. And these families are being supported in somebody's house. And that person would get some reimbursement from the town. And then, of course, they would forward a bill to the state as well, or afterwards, depending. So you'll see records that deal with supporting other members in other communities, giving up stocks of supplies that the town has hoarded over the years. Typically, these are military supplies, so muskets, cannons. We talk about Henry Knox bringing cannons to Dorchester, and we think that, at least in my mind growing up, it was always that was the first time Americans had the chance to have heavy artillery to drive the British out. And there is some truth to that, because there's canon and then there's canon, and Henry Knox is certainly bringing large pieces, heavy mortars, 18, 24-pound cannons. They fire an 18 or 24-pound cannonball, as opposed to, the town of Sharon, which has 2 3-pounder cannons, field artillery pieces. But there are a lot of those. And actually, that's one of the things that has surprised me in looking at some of the town records, just how many of these little 3, 4, 6-pound artillery pieces are floating out there. But we don't really have any sense of how many there are. All we know is that they're out there. And again, these would be with the militia companies. So there's a great opportunity for that as well. And then the last thing I would say too is, and this is something that was born out of a personal experience with some of the town records in Plymouth many years ago. We as historians want to go and we want to find the nice neat book that's labeled Town Records, Volume 2, 1769 to 1775, and that's what we're looking for. And it's all right there, and it's all we have to do is read the 18th century handwriting, which is hard enough, but in the grand scheme of things, that it really isn't that bad. Don't if you have an opportunity to examine town records, whether it is whether it is digitized or in person, don't overlook little slips of paper. They wasted very little in the way of paper, particularly during the early years of the American Revolution when paper was in short supply. And they used every little scrap possible for sending invoices or accounts or making notations. And these are the first things towns tend to get rid of or throw away because they're small, they're loose, they're an annoyance. But they contain potentially some really great information about people in town whose estates are being taken because they support the crown, or they contain information about, John Smith, who made 8 muskets that we sold to the provincial Congress for a huge chunk of cash, or records about fortifications that are being built in the town. The thing that I keep coming back to, and I know Professor Allison's heard me say this a gazillion times, is it never ceases to astonish me how much was asked of these people. And we know, we grow up with the phrase "the greatest generation," meaning the veterans and the people who lived through World War II. And I would never want to take anything from that group of people. Certainly, the crushing of fascism in Europe, I think, is worthy of note and honoring them. But at the same time, the generation that grew up during the American Revolution, just the sheer volume of what they were able to turn out, not just the men who went off to fight, but really what was required of all of the family members in a given community or a given farm to produce not just food and clothing for their own families, but now they're providing food and clothing for their own family, for stranger families they're taking in from communities that are either closed or being bombarded or they're under siege. They're also providing food and clothing for, the 20,000 militiamen that are surrounding the town of Boston, and at the same time having to do without any sort of regular commerce, which is crippling to people who are used to it. You think about all the things we haven't been able to do in this COVID era, and it's frustrating to a lot of people. And but at the same time, it's astonishing. One of the things you'll find as you go through town records is just really how much these people put into the effort of independence.
Thank you, Jonathan. A couple of things. Are you going to hang around for a little bit?
Oh yeah, I'm hanging around.
Very good, good. Because I hope we'll be able to talk about, this makes me excited about going and finding these things. But I think the question a lot of us have is, how do we find them? Before
Sure.
you launch in, I'll give you a break Sean has actually been looking at records in Malden, and so he's going to tell us a little bit about his search and what he's found. This is, it really is an exciting opportunity for us to become historians and dig into these primary sources. So Sean, tell us about what you've been up to in Malden.
All right, yeah, Professor, for sure. So when we got the first assignment to do the primary source analysis, I decided to tackle it by looking into the Malden Statement of Independence. Now, Mr. Lane touched on how back in May, a lot of the committees and stuff were asked to vote on the prospect of independence. Now, Malden is a unique one because it ratified like unanimously for independence, and that has stuff to do with the ties to Charleston and stuff like that. And so, being from Malden, I knew this kind of background lore was there, and at the time, I was like, okay, let's see how it goes. So I typed in the first one and everything like that. And then we got the second one. And I was like, okay, so let's kind of follow up on this. So to do this, I just kind of reached out to the town clerk and in specifically the Malden Public Library, which is also another thing that Mr. Lane touched on. And they were very quick to get back to me and just say, yeah, so we have some records on file. And they, obviously because of COVID, I can't go to the library or anything, but they scanned a couple pages. And I gotta say, for old material, it is quite interesting what's in here. Two things that stick out in particular. I believe in 1777 of May, there is a town meeting held to discuss the prospect of encouraging soldiers to serve in Providence and other New England states. So an encouragement is kind of like a soldier's pay. Like, how can we kind of motivate people to go from Malden to serve in the Continental Army in our neighboring area, which is pretty cool because Malden at the time was a small town. And obviously that's quite a hike and it's a little vague. And then there's another one that sticks out to me because it's on a separate, untitled, just completely different note, is in the same vein. The next page I read was just talking about the possibility of pardoning deceased criminals, just stuff like that. So it goes from revolutionary stuff to kind of the more personal town details that would be happening at a time. So it seems daunting, but I would really say a lot of the towns and cities that we're from have this very rich history, and the clerks and library personnel, they're gonna love to help you out on this. Definitely reach out and just say, I'm doing a project. Any sort of help you can give me is great, because on top of the pages I have from the town meetings, I got a list of servicemen buried in Bell Rock Park near Everett, and then just other stories about Revolutionary Malden. I don't have anything going back from the 1760s or anything, but I mean, I think I have enough to just make something pretty good happen.
Great.
So
That's
it's
great.
definitely, you guys got this.
Great. Just Jonathan.
Do I have the ability to share my screen?
Try it and see.
Let's see. I'm going to see if I can.
Yep. Yes, you do.
Okay. So I just wanted to share this. Let's see, pull this up here. This is actually, so in addition to voting on independence, it was asked when the Declaration of Independence actually arrived in Massachusetts in July of 1776. It was asked that every community copy the Declaration of Independence into their town records. And I don't know at this moment how many of them exist, but this is one that I did find. And it's fascinating. I've found probably about a dozen or 15 so far. in town records that I have access to at the moment. And some of them, like this one here, obviously took pains to try and make it as much like the broadside as possible. And so, you know, you have the large script heading, which the broadside did as well. And a couple of pages later, you'd see the very large signature of John Hancock, which always makes me laugh. And some town clerks obviously took this pretty much like a high school student doing an assignment, which is, oh, I can't believe I have to copy this whole text into the book. But they, you know, so it's just a very much straightforward, you know, line by line copy of the Declaration. But so you'll find things like this in there, and trying to, you know, see if your town, not every town may have done this, but it would be interesting to see what is out there. And while we're on that same vein, I'm going to see if I can pull up this one here. So this one is, it's actually, so this was sent to the provincial Congress, or in this case, it would be the General Court, because it's after the evacuation of Massachusetts. And this was from the town of Braintree. And Braintree is looking for a little support because they invested a lot of time and materials in helping to repair the wharfs and piers that had been damaged in Boston and Marblehead and other communities by depredations of the British and just lack of use. So, you know, they brought out a lot of stone and timber to help repair these places. And, you know, they were out, they argue, 2,000 pounds worth of money. And, you know, is there anything the provincial Congress, and there are a lot of communities that ask for this kind of support. They tend to be seacoast related, but again, I haven't been through every town yet, so gosh only knows what you could find.
Now, some towns had prisoners of war, didn't they?
Yeah, so that's another great one too. And not just, well, so there's a lot of great opportunities, I think, there in particular, not because some communities like the town of Rutland, for instance, which had a prisoner of war camp, but if your town was a county town, so you had the county court in your community, you also had a county jail. And a lot of prisoners of war ended up doing time in county jail just for being prisoners of war. There was no prisoner of war system, particularly early on. So in 1776, this is March like 25th. So the British have been gone for about a week out of Boston. And these 5 ships sail into Boston Harbor loaded with Scottish redcoats. And they don't know the town's been evacuated. And they all get captured, which seems like a great victory for the people of Massachusetts. But then they realize we've got 500 angry Scotsmen that we've got to put somewhere. And so what they ended up doing was they divided up into 5 parcels, and they sent them to the 5 county jails that were closest to Boston. So, and incarceration is one aspect of the prisoner of war story. The other one is, this happens particularly later in the war, the prisoners could actually hire themselves out to other communities, and they could do work on farms, and they'd make a little money to help, you know, improve their imprisonment. They could have an improved diet, they could get clothing, and at the same time, we would help the farmers and other craftsmen or tradesmen make their businesses more profitable, because they weren't paying a going rate for employment, but at the same time, they are getting people to help them do whatever work it is they did. And so you have the town of Northampton, Massachusetts, which was a county town. They did have a county court, but they had 66 German light infantry. They were called Jaegers. So they had 66 Jaegers that were stationed in Northampton as prisoners of war. And these Jaegers would hire themselves out to farmers. Of course, the Pioneer Valley is one of the great growing centers of Massachusetts even today. And they were so successful that the state treasurer or the provincial treasurer kept getting letters from all these other farmers in the Pioneer Valley and the Berkshires saying, dear Mr. Treasurer, my neighbor has 2 Jaegers who work on his farm and they're getting a lot done. And can I have a Jaeger too? And so, there was this whole process of these, it didn't always work out. We do have the stories of some British prisoners who had a liaison with a local woman and ended up killing her husband for her and stuffing him down a well. So, it isn't all happy stories, but there are.
Well, that sounds like a story someone would be interested in finding out more about.
The
hardworking Germans are one thing, but
yes, exactly. And I suspect that there's actually a wonderful diary that I just came across this past year, which is not a town record, but I do want to relate sort of outside the box thinking. And this is a diary of a German surgeon who was captured at the Battle of Bennington it actually was fought in New York, but Bennington's in Vermont, obviously. And he was captured and he was kept prisoner of war in Massachusetts, in Brimfield, Massachusetts, for the better part of a year. And his insights into the daily lives of people in Massachusetts are really just absolutely wonderful. And he's going around with the local minister because this guy's a surgeon, and the minister's dealing with all these both physical and spiritual crises. And the doctor feels he can, as part of his captivity, he can help these people. And at the same time, they pay him for his medical services, which makes his imprisonment a little more bearable.
So, part of what we're looking for are these kind of big picture moments. But then the other really interesting thing are these stories that you never know what you're going to find in these records and what kinds of stories you'll find. So that's, I've left the assignment kind of open-ended and vague because I'm not quite sure what you're going to find as you begin looking. So are there any questions from members of the class about this? Has anyone else gotten started or anyone else thinking about? Yes, Lila.
I started contacting some people, and I live in Abington, so it's kind of small. So if I don't really find much research from here, can I do something like Weymouth the next town over? Or
Yeah.
I can't believe you abandoned the green wave that early.
I know, but everyone's saying that there's it's closed and COVID, and they'll let me know, and they haven't reached out. So
of course, I grew up in Rockland, so
that's
the only
next
reason
town over.
I had to jump in on the Abington thing.
The Bulldogs, you guys are our rivals.
Right.
Ainsley.
So I guess I'm confused, not so much about what we're supposed to research, but what the product you want us to turn in is. Like an essay or?
I agree.
Okay, again, sorry to be vague. Jonathan, do you have any thoughts on what the final product should be?
Well, I mean, let the data guide you, I guess. If you have access to town records, obviously, part of this exercise is to understand the records that your community has. So getting a sense for, are the records, the town records vary from town clerk to town clerk. There is no class you could take in the 18th century to be town clerk. And some of them are very, very thorough and others not so much.
Yeah.
But I think if you find, for instance, a story in the town records that says, on this day, three men absconded from the county jail and burned so-and-so's house. You can look at the impact of events mentioned in the papers. Ideally would want to get a sense of how did your community feel about what was going on? What was your town's involvement in all of the, I don't want to say chaos, but it wasn't really structured in any way either also. Did they support non-importation? Did they have a vote on independence? And if they had a vote on independence, did they support independence? The town of Barnstable decided, we're not going to not support independence, but we're not going to support independence either. So they're in sort of and there's many reasons for that, which I'm sure Professor Allison will tell you at some point. getting a picture of your community and its role in the in the American Revolution. So the Massachusetts militia is made up of three parts. You have the Minutemen, and they are often considered elite, although I would not use that term. They're not elite. They just went to more training. Their effectiveness is about the same as anybody else's, I think. Then there's the trained band, or the what would call the regular militia. And then there's the alarm list, which was all of the old people, say people over the age of 50, and people who would normally be excluded by the militia. So normally your minister doesn't fight, the members of the Board of Selectmen don't fight, but in an alarm, they would be subject to service as well. So how many people did your community lose during the war? How does that, because that affects how the town itself functions. Is your town a seafaring town? Did more men serve in the privateers or in the Navy versus sending troops off to war? I mean, what we're trying to get you to do is to look at the town records and through your experiences, learn how to research a primary source with primary source materials. Learning how to read 18th century handwriting is a skill that you can take with you everywhere. And then, give you a sense of a slice of your town at one moment in time. And it could be through a single event, or it could be through a generalized perspective. Does that help? Yeah. Well, I mean, so what town are you looking at?
I'm from Connecticut, so my town didn't actually
That's
exist
okay.
during the Revolutionary War. It was absorbed by another. I'm not so much confused. I'm just confused about like what we're turning in to get graded, pretty much.
Okay.
Just like, do you want just a couple paragraphs explaining what we found?
No, it should be several pages. And again, it could also be the search, what you found, what the town records looked like, what else is there. In the time you're taking to do this assignment, it's impossible that you would read through the town records, say from 1769 to 1783. You want to kind of know what is there, but you need to choose what it is to focus on. So it could be, maybe the town has meticulous records and the town clerk just wrote down everything, in which case, great. Pick an episode, pick a moment, or look at, as Mr. Lane was saying about, the muster rolls or the treasurer's records about what they're charging, what they're paying, what the economic consequences are. Again, that would require a whole lot of work, but
and actually that's something which I'll just jump on, because every town, and I'll go so far as to say throughout New England, because a lot of this applies to Rhode Island and Connecticut and New Hampshire in particular as well. They regulated the prices for goods and commodities during this time period, and every year at town meeting they would set the prices. So if you were a farmer growing wheat and barley, you could only charge X and no more. It didn't matter how hard it was to find that object. And it wasn't just growing things for people to consume. It was, if you were a carpenter, how much could you charge for a day's labor? Mm-hmm. It was this and no more. So, I mean, that's another aspect. Again, that would be in the town records as well. And so looking at, what a carpenter or a blacksmith or whoever would make, that's another aspect of things.
Anyone else have questions or?
How long should the?
Say between 4 and 6 pages, somewhere in there. If you have someone with really neat handwriting and you want to transcribe, page after page, that's great. And it is due, Marina, toward the end of October, I believe. I'll have to check on the due date. It's the same due date as the assignment that this has been changed into. Actually, not the end of October.
It's due October 30th.
October. So that is coming up. Why don't we push it back to this first week in November? just to give you more time to grapple with this. For some reason, I thought we were at the beginning of October. I thought we had all the time in the world, actually.
Yeah, the other thing which I'll say too is that there are towns who have published their records. There are plenty of town records that have been transcribed and are in published format. So if you're struggling to find something in your community or
or you're not from one of these New England towns that has
Right.
these records, yes.
Look for some of these published records. They're out there, and go through those. As even things that have been published is worthy of data mining.
Now, Jonathan, can you think of anything, since you're the one who's been more in touch with these sources than anyone? Any particular town? Do you think, boy, that would be really an interesting one to look at? Or are there any particular issues you think we should be looking for?
Well, so I come back to the support for independence. I think that's did your town have, or does the town you're looking at, did they have a meeting to support independence? And then the follow-up question to that was, did they copy the Declaration of Independence into the town records? Because I think that says a lot, and in this day and age in particular, when we are debating the value of the Declaration of Independence and other founding documents, for those communities at that time to copy it into the town records, I think says a lot. And then again, I come back to looking at the non-importation agreements. I know that may seem a little less than exotic, but what I'm interested in are the words of the people. What are they saying about the issues that they're facing? What are they saying about taxation? Because taxation becomes a huge issue in Massachusetts at the end of the American Revolution. So what are they saying about taxation? What are they saying about the rights? When they talk about enumerated rights, what are the rights they talk about? And again, it's really interesting as you go through the town records to see some communities, they write these letters in 1773 around the issues of the tea. And when they talk about enumerating their rights as citizens, some communities focus on the no taxation without representation thing. Some communities are very much focused on the growth of a centralized government that's far away from where they live, which I think is interesting. Some are really, because of in 1772, the people of Rhode Island burned the British ship, the HMS Gaspee. They're concerned about people being taken to England for trial. And so, but every community is they're not all writing something different, but there are differences in what these communities are writing. So to me, it speaks a lot to what they view as their most important and sacred rights, because these are the ones they were including on their list of grievances. So looking at, communications they're having with the provincial Congress or with the general court or the committees of correspondence. I mean, trying to get a sense, for me, I'm interested in what are they thinking? What's their thought process? What is important to them? Because that can help drive the way we look at how the whole story of the revolution developed in this region in the 1760s and 1770s. Obviously, data-driven things, I think, if you find a document that has interesting data, and I'll give you an example. The town of Westboro, Massachusetts, has some of their records from the American Revolution digitized online. And one of the documents that they had was a list of materials that they were sending to Bennington, then in the New Hampshire Grants, now in Vermont, for the use of the soldiers who were beginning to gather in the general Saratoga area. Now, I have to be honest, I know a fair amount of the Battle of Saratoga, but I did not know that the towns and cities of Massachusetts were forwarding supplies to Bennington as a storage depot. And here you have a town, and this is their list of goods. And so you look at the list of goods that they're providing, and it's blankets, it's shirts, it's shoes, it's canteens that they are all forwarding. So you can take a single document from that, like that, and you can write easily 4 pages on the material, the kinds of materials they're gathering, why are they gathering, why are they forwarding it to Bennington, why Bennington, and then the question is, of course, they're paying somebody to carry that to Bennington, so they have to hire somebody who's got enough spare time that they can go with a cart and a horse, or a cart and an oxen. It's probably a 4 or 5 day trip to Bennington and back from Westboro in 1777. So, just one simple document like that can easily provide a paper's worth of questions, and give you an opportunity to do a little research into answering those questions.
Other questions or thoughts on this? A couple of people have been volunteering where they are from. So we have Sharon, Malden, Abington, Weymouth. I don't know if it would be worthwhile for people to find out if there's someone else doing the same town, or since Sean's told us how exciting Malden is, I don't want everyone now to say I'm from Malden, but
Sharon's a cool town because it was part of, it was Stoughtonham, and that's really one of the major manufacturers for cannons and muskets in the Revolution.
anyone else want to ask about their town and have find out if there's anything exciting there, or have you already found out things that are exciting and you don't want to tell us? Yes, Lily again.
Jonathan, I know you said you're from Rockland. Have you done any research on like Rockland and found anything cool? Because it's literally like 5 minutes from my house. So if I don't find anything from Abington.
Well, I have to say, I go through this little phase of PTSD when I start thinking about my hometown. So
Me too.
So, as I said, I grew up in the Bicentennial, and I remember vividly all of the things that we did in Rockland during the Bicentennial, and I know the history of Rockland, which I learned in, the 4th grade, pretty well still, actually. And of course, Rockland didn't exist. Really, I mean, we were divided between, Abington. Abington's really, one of the main towns in that region at the time, and in Weymouth. Hingham's a great choice, by the way, if you need another town to go to. Benjamin Lincoln, of course, is from Hingham, and the Hingham Minutemen and other militia guys. They're really active, and I can't remember what the status of their records are. I should have brought my spreadsheet with me so I could speak a little directly. But if you have, and I want to say this to all your students, Bob, that if any of you have specific questions, or if you're struggling with finding information, or you need an assist on where to take something, feel free to shoot me an email. It's jlane, JLANE, at mass, MASS, HIST, HIST.org. And I'm happy to, help you out in any way I can.
Okay, as you've been talking, towns have been flooding in. So Marina is from Marshfield, and she says all she knows is it seems like it was fairly loyal, and that's good if you have loyalists in town. But can you tell us anything more?
Yeah, I do know the Marshfield town records are outstanding. Of course, the Marshfield town records go all the way back to 1627, when Edward Winslow was chosen the first moderator of a town meeting in Massachusetts, and that is an office that continues to this day. And actually, my very first serious transcribing job was to transcribe the the Marshfield town records from 1627 to 1645 as part of a long dead project for the North River Collaborative or something. So there's lots of wonderful records there. Actually, so I have sort of tied in with that. I recently just had a couple of friends who came back from the Clement Library in University of Michigan, and they were looking for records about the British occupation of Marshfield. And one of the stories we came across in these records was a deserter from the 10th Regiment of Foot who deserted from Marshfield, and he sneaks his way all the way across into Middleborough, which also had quite a few loyalists, including Peter Oliver, who was a senior justice he was the Chief Justice of Massachusetts, and his son, and they owned a gazillion acres of land. But anyway, so Marshall, I think, is a great place to start because it is very complex. And let me also say too, that if you have not visited the Committee of Correspondence Records at the New York Public Library, they are all digitized. And in most cases, not all, but in most cases, they're broken out by town. So if you're struggling to find something and you want to look something up, go to the New York Public Library, Google Committee of Correspondence, Boston Committee of Correspondence Records.
I believe I put a link on our Blackboard page to those. If not, I will do that because they're terrific records.
Yeah, and again, it really gives you a sense of where people are, where people are. So I think Marshfield is a great. I mean, definitely there's a lot more work that needs to be done in Marshfield. They of course have Tea Hill, where they burnt the tea instead of tossing it into the water in '73. They do have a loyalist population. They had essentially at one point seemed to have dueling town meetings going on. So I think that would be a real interesting community.
Okay. What about North Attleboro? Do you have anything on North Attleboro?
North Attleboro, again, I don't remember when the Attleboro split, which would be a question, but that region in particular, so I live in Lincoln, Rhode Island now, and is really fascinating. I have long family ties to that region going back to the 17th century, and they participate a lot in things that are going on in Rhode Island. So the Battle of Rhode Island is filled with guys from Attleboro. So I think there's a great opportunity there as well. I don't know the status of their town records. What I can do, Bob, is I'll send you my spreadsheet that I've been working on.
I think actually I also have that on our Blackboard page.
Okay, good. All right.
Yeah.
So if you have that, then that's great. Then I would start there.
Yeah.
It's not by any means definitive or complete. It's a work in progress.
Well, that's another thing we're hoping that this class will be able to do if their town isn't. What about Revere?
Well, of course, Revere didn't exist as a separate town.
Yeah.
But it's funny you should say that because I had this we have a bill up before the state legislature to create a commission for the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, and of course, the speaker represents Revere, does he not? That's part of his constituency. So I remember before we went to meet the speaker, looking for what happened in Revere, and Bob would tell you certainly anything you can do relating to that part of the coast, from the Battle of Chelsea Creek, where they burned, where the militia, the Patriot militia, were able to encourage a British ship that was to run aground, and then they burnt it and stripped it for parts, which was great. They're making constant raids on the Boston Harbor Islands, and those men are coming from those area, Chelsea, all the way up to Marblehead, and then on the South Shore from essentially from Marshfield all the way up through Weymouth. These guys are out there, they're raiding the islands because that's where a lot of cattle are kept. So they're going off to capture cattle, they're burning stalks of hay, and of course the Americans destroyed Boston Lighthouse and takes a number of British prisoners while doing so. So that's that would be interesting. And I don't think that part of Massachusetts did much for material supplies.
Yeah, Plainville was another place that might not have existed then, but
I don't think so. But again, that area, that Franklin, Sharon, that sort of corner of Massachusetts down near Rhode Island is really from the 18th century perspective, industrial.
Mhm.
So, this is where they're beginning to use mill
Yeah.
power on a larger scale. They're producing a lot for the armies.
Yeah, good. Let's see, someone else, actually here too, that I know could have a lot to talk about. Someone's from Arlington, and I think you should know that Arlington saw most of the fighting on the 19th of April of 1775. It was actually then known as Menotomy, if I'm not mistaken. And so there is that. Anything else you can tell us about Menotomy, Arlington?
I believe they've published their town records.
Yeah.
If I remember correctly. So that's where I would start. There's also a lot of great work that's being done on the Jason Russell House.
Yes.
I know they just did some not archaeological, but architectural work around the Jason Russell House, and has been part of our monument study
Good,
for
good,
the Revolution.
good. Let's see, and someone asked about Marblehead.
I don't even know where to begin on Marblehead.
Yeah, there's
It's
a lot
just
there.
there's a lot there. So the people up in Marblehead, I love them. They are single-handedly trying to promote the memory of Jeremiah Lee, whose mansion still stands and is the center point of the Marblehead Historical? Is
Yeah.
that their name? But there's a lot there. I mean,
Mhm.
privateering is definitely an underrepresented story
Yes.
in the American Revolution, early naval action. And so the other thing which I wanted to say too, when they closed the port of Boston, I'm sure most of us have heard the stories about the other communities coming together and providing support, sending sheep and cattle to Boston, and grains and flour, and this is done throughout all 13 colonies and beyond. I mean, Montreal, Quebec, they all contributed towards the support of the people of Boston, and anything that came by sea had to go in through Marblehead. And so Marblehead is sort of a replacement Boston as a port city. I think would be a very interesting study.
And they have the Spirit of 76 and Elbridge Gerry and John Glover, and
Glover's another person who deserves a little
Yeah.
more historical treatment. There
Does, yeah.
isn't, particularly in the early years of the war, Washington wouldn't have survived without Glover.
that's very true, very true. Good. Weymouth, I think we've talked a little bit about Weymouth, and other questions, other towns? This has been great. I mean, we could just have a list of towns and have Canton. Okay, Nicole is from Canton.
Yeah, so if you have trouble getting information from Canton, definitely let me know. George Comeau, of course,
Oh, yeah.
the president of the Canton Historical Society down there. And they're doing a lot of work on revitalizing the Paul Revere site, which, of course, is after the Revolution. But again, they're part of that whole Stoughtonham area where they're really driving the industrial industry of Massachusetts, boring cannons. There was actually in 1775, Paul Revere spent some time in Philadelphia, or in the Philadelphia area, learning how to make gunpowder. And he comes back and he establishes a gunpowder mill in Canton. And there's definitely learning a little bit more about that would be useful.
Good.
And Salem, I would say the same thing.
Yeah.
Salem is where to start. I've been in touch with a lot of people in Salem recently. I know a good portion of their records have been published, and there's a lot of data there.
Mhm.
A lot of data
Yeah.
for the people of Salem on both sides, both
Right.
looking at the people who supported the crown and the people who supported the patriot cause.
Yeah. And again, maybe the Salem, Marblehead folks, and if there's anyone from Beverly, we can determine where exactly the Navy was born.
Right.
Ainsley, you have your...
Yeah, so I'm from southeastern Connecticut. So I was looking at records of privateering and the burning of New London.
Oh, yeah.
Good, great.
Is it okay within the parameters of the assignment for me to reach out to the museum at Fort Griswold, which is
Yes.
about the Battle of Groton Heights as well.
Yes.
Would you
Ainsley, if you send me your email address, because I was actually one of the things I've been doing during this whole COVID period is my mental health day is going to visit sites like Griswold and that I haven't been to, but I actually have downloaded the after action report of the battle, which was written by the British commander, and also the map that was done to accompany it. So I can send those to you. Those might be useful.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
No, there's a tremendous amount there. And I think this has been really helpful in getting us to think about what is available. And if you are not from one of these towns, not from around here, you still can look at any of these communities and see what you can find, because it really is, just as we've been talking, I've realized what an extraordinary story it is. It isn't just what happened in Boston or what happened in Philadelphia. It really is what happens in these towns. And I'm very excited now about this project. I hope you are. You're the ones who are going to be doing the work. But it really is exciting to find out what's going on in these places and getting in touch directly with these people through these sources. Good. So other thoughts on this? Actually, Jonathan, I didn't realize we would be spending all of this time. This is great, and spared them having to hear about the winter at Valley Forge and other things that I was going to share with them. But this, I think, was much more interesting, getting a sense of what they can find.
Yeah, and let me just share sort of, you brought up Valley Forge, which made me want to just say one other thing that for this coming commemoration, one of the things that we're looking at is helping people who are interested in tracing their family members meet up with. So there's three parts of this. There are the people who want to learn more about their families. There are these heritage societies that are looking to both increase their membership, but also have quite a bit of information. And then there are the archives like the American Antiquarian Society, Mass Historical Society, the State Archives. So trying to bring those three groups together in a way that is useful and potentially profitable for groups is something we're particularly interested in. And Bob's comment about the Valley Forge made me want to say that one of my ancestors that I admire, I guess, is the fellow who answered the Lexington Alarm on April 19th, 1775. He decided to sign up with the Continental Army, marched with them, served all the way through Valley Forge, and then in 1778 decided he had had enough. So he comes home to his town of Rehoboth, Massachusetts, where he signs on to a privateer. And later that same year, he loses his leg in a battle with a British man of war. And, you know, that to me, that's just what a great story. And that's definitely not the norm for most people, but, you know, it is an interesting for these people who live these lives to be at places like Valley Forge and then out on the sea. I think lots of great opportunities for story.
Right. A lot of great stories there. Ainsley, is your hand up again?
No, I think it was from last time. Sorry.
Okay, good. Well, I think we've accomplished a lot, and I will make sure I've posted the things we've posted. If you have any further questions, it's jlane@masshist.org, masshist.org. And as you can see, he is a fountain of information. You're probably wondering how come we couldn't get him to teach this class instead of me. And
They're much better off.
This has been great. Good. Any further questions, thoughts? Okay, well, I will. Yes, Lela.
Do you want to work cited with this paper?
Yes.
Okay.
That's good. Very good question. Yes. And in this case, you're going to be citing the document, and if it's available on a website, give the website. I'll give you further instructions on the work cited for this, because this is actually more important than a lot of the other, if you're doing simply a secondary source, because what you're doing hopefully is finding a source that maybe no one else has ever looked at. I mean, someone did digitize it, but that's it. Yes, Jesse.
But even if it's private, still just write out what it was.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you found this letter in your grandmother's attic, then yeah, you do have to say where you found it.
Okay.
Yeah. And
Oh, sorry.
no, Jesse,
Um,
go on.
You said this was due on the 30th of October?
Yeah, we've changed that to, why don't we say the end of the following week? So that's what, about the 7th, I think, of November? So yeah, to give you more time, because I realized you would be rushing and I want you to really dive in and enjoy this. So yeah, good. So yeah, so just on November the 7th, I think. Okay. Other questions, thoughts? Of course, if
This
you
could
already
be a
have,
topic we could talk about for our podcast episode, right?
this would be a great thing to talk about for your podcast episode. Yes. So yeah. So that's something else to be thinking about. And with the podcast, I'm thinking maybe people should work together on that. If you'd rather work alone, let me know. But I think since this is really a good group, and I think you would benefit from working with each other. So something we can discuss. But see, my tendency is when I have Jonathan here is just to ask him what we should do. But I realize I'm the one teaching the class. So yeah, so that's a good thing. If you find something worthwhile for the podcast, great. It would be much more interesting than having, you do yet another rendition of, say, the Battle of Bunker Hill. Not that that isn't a fascinating subject, but yeah, I'm really curious to see what you'll find. There's all kinds of stuff out there. So good. Other thoughts, comments, questions? Okay, then I'll let you go and I'll see you all on Wednesday.
Thank you.
Take care.
You're doing, Professor.
Thank you, Jonathan. This was
Thanks.
great.
Thanks, Bob.
See you tomorrow.
Thank
bet.
you, Mr. Lane.
Professor, I actually had a question I forgot
Yes,
to
Megan.
have you sent our paper grades for the last paper? Because I haven't seen it anywhere.
I'll double check to see if I have, okay?
I want some feedback for this too. Thank you.
Okay.